Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another Orchid Care for Beginners episode. It is the last one for this year, and I thought it would be suited to end it on a super good subject, and this is watering orchids no matter how you might grow them. Be them in bark, sphagnum moss, terracotta pots, and even soil. I'm going to tell you about the correct or recommended ways in which you can water these orchids, and rest assured that you will perform a safe and proper watering. Today's episode, along with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by Reptibark.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. Some of the accessories that I will use in this care series and in today's video are provided by Reptibark, so I will link you to their website down below in the description. Feel free to visit them at any time. So with that said, don't forget to give this video a like if you end up enjoying it, and why not subscribe? I post 3 times a week. So with that said, let's start with the setup most used by home growers with their orchids. And this is a medium consisting only of bark chips. In many places around the world, the most popular orchid of the moment, the Phalaenopsis orchid, is actually being sold in a full bark chips medium. There are some exceptions, we're gonna get to them, but most people associate orchid medium with bark chips rather than anything else. So I think it's fitting to start with this medium since it is very common and it is actually suitable for orchids. Bark chips are a solid, non-water retentive material. They're also not very good at wicking water, but they're very good at providing aeration. Very similar to bark chips are charcoal, which is used in certain parts of the world as a main medium for orchids, and also leca or hydroton. Depending where you're from, you will call it either one of these names. Mind you, I'm not referring to a semi-hydroponic setup, which we'll get to. I'm just referring to the leca material itself. All of these materials are really weak when it comes to water retention and fairly weak when it comes to wicking water in comparison to other materials. For this reason, depending on your environment, there are a few techniques of watering orchids potted in this media. For environments that tend to be rather dry and or warm, it can be a more suitable way to actually soak orchid pots. In this way, we allow the roots to absorb a quantity of water within the period in which they are submerged in water, and we also give a chance to the bark to soak to some little extent and maintain just a little bit more water in its structures or in the air pockets. Through soaking, you can actually increase the period of time in between waterings, so if you don't have a lot of time for watering, this might be a technique you might want to look into. For environments that are pretty humid and are not necessarily very cold, running water through the pot will work just as well. In this way, we don't actually soak way too much the roots of the orchid. We also don't allow the air gaps to get filled with water. With this technique, chances of the pot retaining a bigger quantity of water are reduced. And this can be a good thing or a bad thing, as I was saying, depending on environment. But it's not incorrect to just run water through your pot. You can do so at the sink or on the shelf where your orchid resides, as long as you remove all the water accumulated beneath the pot. Next up, we have sphagnum moss, which is another very popular medium you can find orchids potted in. In some parts of the world, Phalaenopsis orchids, and more specifically mini Phalaenopsis, are always potted in a pot full of sphagnum moss, no bark or other materials. And if used properly and where you can actually benefit from it, sphagnum moss is a great medium. Unlike bark, sphagnum moss retains a lot of water, and not only does it retain it, it's also a very good wicking material. The downside of sphagnum moss is that it's not a rigid material, so it can compact easily, and if misused, it can actually suffocate the orchid roots. So special care needs to be taken when working with sphagnum moss. Just a side note, I do have a video for beginners in which I talk more about the most popular media for orchids and how to properly use them. If you think you could use a few tips in that department, check the description down below, and I hope you will find the answers you're looking for. When watering orchids potted in sphagnum moss, it isn't actually necessary to soak them. As I was saying, moss can retain a lot of water, so we can actually control the quantity of water we add to the pot. Unlike a pot with bark, which will pretty much retain a pretty fine quantity of water, when it comes to moss, it isn't always a great idea to fully saturate it. For this reason, many people actually just run water through a pot full of sphagnum moss rather than soaking it. It is not a bad practice to soak it, but it should only be used if you really need it. If you don't have experience with sphagnum moss yet, I would advise you to just run a little water through the pot, and that is it. Alternatively, you can just sit the pot in water for a minute or two, and the sphagnum moss will actually absorb a little bit of water and then distribute it evenly. You really don't need to fully saturate the sphagnum moss in order to water the orchid. The main goal is just to keep it damp. And for this reason, sphagnum moss is not necessarily the friendliest medium for beginners, but as I was saying, it is very common, especially with miniature Phalaenopsis and sometimes even with jewel orchids. More experienced growers will, however, choose a combination between sphagnum moss and bark chips, and maybe some other aeration materials as well. In this instance, the watering technique will have to be adapted to your environment, season, type of orchid, or just lifestyle in the end. If you have a little bit more sphagnum moss than bark and other aeration materials, you can just run water through the pot and everything should be okay. But if you have more bark and aerative materials such as leca, lava rock or sponge rock or perlite or things of the sorts, but not a lot of sphagnum moss, you can actually go ahead and soak this pot if you feel like you have to water your orchid way too often and you just don't have time for that. I do actually have a video in which I explain a little bit more the relation between environment and type of mixture you have, although it's with Phalaenopsis, but check it down below in the description if you want to hear a bit more about the mixes, how they will perform, and the type of environments they are suited to according to their ratios. Personally, I do actually have most of my collection in a mixture of sphagnum moss and bark chips, and in this way I can actually control the quantity of water that my pot retains, but at the same time I can provide a lot of aeration through those bark chips, which will make sure that even though my pots retain more water, they will not become suffocating and just compacted for the orchid roots. An orchid setup which has gained popularity in the past few years is semi-hydroponics, using as medium leca or hydroton. Now, as I was saying, leca itself is not a super water retentive or wicking material. Even though it is much better at it than bark chips or charcoal, it is still not as good as sphagnum moss when it comes to wicking. The way to water this setup is by running water through the pot, letting it drain through the drainage holes on the sides of the pot, and then letting water accumulate in the reservoir that the drainage holes create with the pot, and then letting the leca soak up the water in the reservoir and direct it upwards to the orchid. Now, this setup can actually work very well for particular climates. I myself found that my climate is just way too hot for this setup to function properly and how it was designed to function, so I'm personally not using that setup at the moment. But if you are, or you've never gave it a go, it is a very good alternative that could benefit you, and now you know how to water it as well. Keeping orchids mounted on a piece of ceramic or wood is a nice way to let them grow a little bit more natural than they do in pots. However, when it comes to watering, they can prove to be quite a lot more high maintenance than potted orchids. If you're a beginner and you're growing your orchids mainly in your home rather than a greenhouse or outdoors, you can try to first spray the root system of your orchid until you get it wet, or if you have some sphagnum moss on the mount, until you get the sphagnum moss wet. Or if you find that that simply does not hydrate the orchid enough, you can actually soak the entire mount in a different dish or a bowl or whatever can fit the entire mount. The frequency of watering with mounted orchids is higher than all of the setups that I will talk about today, with the exception of one, maybe. But for the main part, mounted orchids should be watered no matter the technique, once a day, once every 2 days, depending a lot on the environment, but definitely they will need watering a lot more frequent than potted orchids. As a little PS, we actually recently talked more about mounted orchids and what you should know about them before you grow them, so you have the links towards that video in the description. Some orchids are grown and sold bare-rooted, which means they don't have any type of medium around their root system, they're not even mounted to a piece of wood, and most of the times these will be the vandas. And in this instance, watering will refer only to the root system. Again, if you're growing your orchid in your living room, not necessarily outside in the warmth. And you can water the root system through showering it in your bathroom or at the kitchen sink, or you can mist them with a spray bottle if you can make sure you will not make a puddle of water in the middle of your living room. Or you can actually find a different bowl, such as a vase or any other type of container that can fit the root system, and just let the orchid sit for 10 to 15 minutes. Soaking orchids will always be more beneficial in very warm or very dry environments. And sometimes homes can be very dry and very warm. So you will have to trial and error a little bit these techniques based on how your orchid reacts. But basically, just like mounted orchids, these guys will need you to water them a lot more frequently than potted orchids. Actually, we pot orchids, even though they naturally don't grow in soils or anything of the sorts, simply to make our lives with watering easier. And if we make sure the pot is very ventilated, we are getting away with it with flying colors. But growing orchids bare-rooted or mounted is not wrong, and it can give you a different perspective on your orchid, maybe a more natural perspective. But you need to have time to water them. Using one of these techniques once a day, multiple times a day, or once every few days should be adequate depending on environment and your availability. Another very popular setup with vandas, but not only, with things such as gomgoras, which produce flower spikes from the bottom of the so-called pot, is the basket setup. And here I have a wooden basket. It is very, very ventilated, which is one of the traits of this type of setup. And inside I have a combination between sphagnum moss and bark chips. Now, no matter what you have inside the basket, you may not actually have anything in the basket. You can water this orchid in two ways. One, you can run water through the entire basket, pretty much dosing the basket down. And if you have an orchid outside, this is a very good technique since you have a lot of wind outside and evaporation is faster. Or if you are concerned about letting water sit too much in the crown and joints of your orchid, and especially if your orchid is indoors, I suggest you actually soak the basket. Even if you have sphagnum moss in the basket, since ventilation is abundant in a basket setup, you can actually fully or at least partially submerge the basket in a different container, let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes, and hey presto, the orchid is watered. The frequency will have to depend on environment and, of course, how fast the medium or the orchid roots dry. But as a bit of a general rule, the more airy the basket or pot or setup is, the more appropriate soaking becomes for your orchid. Now let's talk a little bit about pots. You might have noticed that some orchids are potted in plastic pots while others are grown in terracotta pots. Well, there is a difference in these materials, and the major difference is water evaporation. Unglazed clay pots are very porous, and they actually lose water to the environment much faster than plastic pots. For this reason, the medium used in a clay pot can actually be a little bit more water retentive. And in this instance, since the clay itself is wicking and absorbent as well, we can actually opt for multiple styles of watering. First, obviously, we can run water through the pot, get it properly wet, and then let it drain and put it back in its place. We can also soak it if we have a very hot or very dry environment. And finally, my technique, it has to do with the medium I use, which does have sphagnum moss. I like to just run water through the pot, let it accumulate in the dish, and then just sit the pot back and let it absorb. Clay pots will wick and absorb that water and direct it to the top, and the sphagnum moss will do the same thing inside. And in a matter of a few hours, everything will just even out, and both the clay pot and the medium inside will be even and moist. Not soggy wet, but they will be just perfect for the orchid. Some orchids we can grow are terrestrial or semi-terrestrial, as I like to call them, meaning they don't grow on trees, they're not epiphytic, and in this instance we can actually use a soil type of medium, which can be aerated with perlite or bark or other aeration materials, but definitely it will act a little bit different than all the other mixes. In this instance, you can actually water this orchid just like you would any houseplant. If you find that in your environment it's enough to just run a little water through the pot, drain it, and then dump out the water in the dish, then that's what you should do with the terrestrial orchids as well. If you find that in your environment it is a good idea to leave the water in the dish for a few hours for the pot to absorb it, then that's what you should do with your orchid as well. This is what I do since I have a hot environment, and it's been working beautifully. A self-watering pot has the added benefit of storing water in its reservoir without actually sitting the orchid in water. And when it comes to watering such an orchid, the best technique is to just run water through the interior pot. You can do so at the sink or over a saucer of sorts, just to eliminate whatever salt buildup might have created in the pot. And then you can fill the reservoir with fresh, clean water, or you can actually water the orchid on the shelf and let whatever water drains go in the reservoir and then be reabsorbed by the pot. Now, if for whatever reason you don't actually want to have anything in the reservoir, maybe in winter time you don't actually need so much water, then you can obviously dump out the water in the reservoir and use this just as a normal pot with a pretty decorative container on the outside. Just because a self-watering pot has a reservoir doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it all the time. It just means it's a place for water to accumulate, and there is a mechanism that wicks it back up into the pot if you so desire. But sometimes you might not desire this, and it's perfectly fine to just remove the water from the reservoir. And of course, there might be a multitude of other setups that I didn't mention, but I wanted to go through the most popular setups and give you a little glimpse if you're a beginner, if you don't have a lot of experience with orchids, that really there is an infinite variety of ways in which you can grow orchids. They can be healthy, they can be happy, and you can water them in various different ways. The thing to just keep in mind at all times, even when you're trying out new things, is that the environment and the type of medium you use will have a great impact on the technique of watering as well. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Thank you Reptibark for sponsoring this entire Orchid Care for Beginners series. This is our second year, so in these past 2 years we made super awesome tutorials for beginners, which I will share with you down below. They're all in a playlist, and who knows, maybe we will continue next year as well. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!